It began like any other red-eye flight. Just after midnight on March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. 239 people on board, parents, children, business travelers. Crew, the weather was clear, the flight path routine. 40 minutes in, it simply vanished. One moment, MH370's transponder was pinging air traffic control with perfect clarity. The next, it dropped off the radar, as if the aircraft had been erased from the sky. No distress call, no mayday, no hint of trouble. In the hours that followed, confusion gave way to disbelief, then panic. Military radar showed something impossible, the plane turning sharply off course, heading back across Malaysia, then out over the remote southern Indian Ocean, one of the emptiest stretches of water on Earth. No wreckage was found for years. Families clung to hope, investigators clung to theories. But what really happened in those final hours remains one of the most haunting mysteries. In aviation history, this is the story of the flight that never came home. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was a Boeing 777-200R, a long-haul workhorse with a spotless safety record. The crew that night was experienced. The captain, Zahri Ahmad Shah, was 53 years old, with more than 18,000 hours of flight time. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27, was relatively new to the 777, but well-trained. The passenger list read like a cross-section of the modern world. Chinese families returning home. Australian tourists, a group of Malaysian artists heading to an exhibition in Beijing. A French couple on their way to visit relatives. Among them, two young boys traveling alone to see their mother. At 12:41 a.m. local time, MH370 rolled down the runway at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The 777 climbed smoothly, banking northeast toward the South China Sea. Air traffic control cleared them to flight level 350 minus 35,000 feet. At 1:19 a.m., the aircraft approached the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. The last known voice transmission came over the radio, a calm male voice saying, "Good night, Malaysian 370. 2 minutes later, the plane's transponder stopped transmitting. On civilian radar screens, MH370 disappeared. At first, no one assumed disaster. It wasn't unusual for planes to temporarily vanish. During a handoff between radar sectors, controllers in Ho Chi Minh City expected MH370 to check in. Any second, minutes passed, then more. They tried to contact the flight. No response. Malaysian controllers, realizing the silence was unusual, began calling the aircraft on emergency frequencies. Still nothing. By 2:40 a.m., a formal alert had been raised. But the initial search began in the wrong place, based on the last transponder coordinates. Rescuers were sent to the waters of the South China Sea, along MH370's planned route to Beijing. What no one knew yet was that military radar had continued tracking the plane after it vanished from civilian screens. Those returns showed something chilling, a sharp left turn, back across the Malay Peninsula, then northwest along the Strait of Malacca. This was not a mechanical failure sending the plane into a death spiral. This was a deliberate change in course. Meanwhile, on the ground, families were beginning to wake up to news alerts. At Beijing Capital International Airport, relatives gathered in the arrivals hall, watching the board, where MH370 status flickered from on time to delayed, then simply blank. The first press statements were vague. An incident, a possible loss of contact. Journalists began to assemble. The words missing and unaccounted for replaced delayed. Back at the airline's operations center, flight dispatchers pulled up every scrap of data they could find. The Boeing 777 was equipped with ACARS, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, which automatically sends engine and performance data to the airline every half hour. Those transmissions had stopped around the same time as the transponder, but not all signals were gone. Deep within the aircraft's electronics, another system was quietly alive. The satellite data unit, linking the plane to an Inmarsat communication satellite over the Indian Ocean. Even though no messages were being sent, the system still exchanged hourly handshakes with the satellite. Those handshakes would become the key to everything that followed and to the dawning realization that MH370 had not crashed anywhere near its flight path. By dawn on March 8th, it was clear this was no simple communication failure. The aircraft had enough fuel for roughly 7 hours of flight. If it had gone down in the South China Sea, Search teams should have found debris quickly. Instead, nothing. No oil slicks, no floating luggage, no bodies. Then came the military radar data. The sharp left turn over the South China Sea was followed by a long, steady westward track across the Malay Peninsula. The altitude fluctuated wildly, at one point dipping below 12,000 feet before climbing back to cruising height. These changes suggested manual control, not autopilot. As the sun rose, the last confirmed radar contact came over the northern tip of Sumatra, heading toward the Andaman Sea. From there, the plane slipped beyond radar coverage entirely. The focus shifted to the satellite handshakes. Faint electronic breadcrumbs that showed MH370 was still airborne for nearly 6 more hours. After its last radar sighting, analysts at Inmarsat plotted the timing and frequency of these pings, discovering they traced a rough arc across the southern Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from the intended route to Beijing. At 8:19 a.m., the final handshake occurred. There was no next ping. By then, the plane's fuel would have been exhausted. The most likely scenario, the aircraft descended somewhere along that remote southern arc in seas so vast and deep that a search could take years. But how and why had the plane traveled so far off course? Investigators began to scrutinize the crew. Captain Zahari was respected, meticulous, and a flight simulator enthusiast. The passenger list offered its own puzzles. 2 men traveling on stolen passports had initially raised alarms, but both turned out to be asylum seekers with no apparent connection to terrorism. There was no ransom demand, no group claiming responsibility, no intercepted messages. Technical failure was still on the table, but experts pointed out that losing both communications and navigation systems simultaneously without any mayday was rare, and a deliberate turn suggested someone was flying the aircraft. Meanwhile, the families waited in limbo. In Beijing, some were moved to hotels under guard. Others refused to leave the airport. Many clung to the hope that the plane had been hijacked and landed somewhere. Days without debris felt, perversely, like proof of survival. Search operations expanded west into the Andaman Sea and south toward Australia. Dozens of ships and aircraft from multiple nations scoured hundreds of thousands of square miles. But the ocean gave up nothing. Weeks turned into months. Public interest turned into public anger. Press conferences grew tense, with relatives shouting questions and officials offering vague, technical answers. The Malaysian government released partial radar timelines, satellite analysis, and maps of the 7th arc, the line along which the plane was believed to have run out of fuel. Then, in July 2015, 16 months after the disappearance, the first confirmed piece of MH370 was found. A flagment from a Boeing 777 washed up on Reunion Island, thousands of miles west of the search zone. The discovery proved the plane had ended in the Indian Ocean, but not precisely where. Over the next 2 years, more debris appeared on the coasts of Mozambique, Tanzania, and Madagascar. Interior cabin panels, wing fragments, even a piece of the horizontal stabilizer. Each scrap was examined for clues. Some showed signs of damage consistent with high-speed impact. Others were too weathered to tell. None could answer the question that haunted everyone. What happened in the cockpit that night? Theories multiplied. A deliberate act by the captain. A sudden decompression that incapacitated everyone except the hijacker. A slow hypoxia event. Oxygen starvation, with the plane flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. A fire that knocked out communications but allowed the crew to keep flying. But all shared the same final chapter. A silent descent into the world's loneliest ocean, out of sight, out of reach. By early 2017, the official search, the most expensive in aviation history, was suspended. A private effort by Ocean Infinity later scoured an additional 25,000 square kilometers, but found nothing. With no black boxes, no complete wreckage, and no survivors, MH370 had become more than a missing plane. It was a wound for aviation, for families, for the idea that in the 21st century, a modern jetliner could simply vanish. When the official search for MH370 was suspended in January 2017, there was no ceremony, no closure, just a terse announcement. The decision to suspend the search was not taken lightly, nor without sadness. For the families, it was as if the plane had disappeared all over again. Without a wreck site or black boxes, there was no definitive cause, no final chapter to tell them how or why their loved ones had died. Grief had no shape to settle into. Some relatives refused to give up. They launched their own search initiatives, crowd-funded expeditions, and even hired oceanographers to reanalyze drift patterns. Each new piece of confirmed debris brought a bittersweet jolt, proof the plane had ended in the Indian Ocean, but also proof it would never be found intact. The mystery fed endless speculation. Some pilots believed the turnback maneuver was too precise to be anything but deliberate, possibly by the captain himself. Others suggested a sudden catastrophic event that knocked out communications but left the plane flyable. A few theorized a hijacking gone wrong, with whoever was in control steering into the most remote waters on Earth to avoid detection. Satellite data offered fragments of truth. Analysts examining the final handshakes saw changes in frequency consistent with a rapid descent in the last minutes, possibly a high-speed plunge. If true, the impact would have shattered the 777 into millions of pieces, scattering debris across thousands of miles. But without the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, or a larger wreckage field, every scenario was conjecture. Even the theory of a ghost flight, where crew and passengers are incapacitated by hypoxia, and the plane flies itself until fuel runs out, had holes. Military radar had shown sharp altitude changes early in the diversion, suggesting someone was at the controls. For the aviation industry, MH370 was a wake-up call. In an age of GPS, satellites, and global connectivity, the fact that a large commercial airliner could vanish without a trace was unthinkable. Airlines and regulators began pushing for real-time tracking of aircraft, with position updates every minute instead of every 30 minutes. Some carriers installed systems to automatically stream black box data to the ground in emergencies. For the people left behind, though, these changes were little comfort. In Kuala Lumpur, the families of the crew gathered every March 8th, lighting candles, reading names, and releasing paper lanterns into the night sky. In Beijing, relatives of Chinese passengers wore black armbands, holding photos and placards demanding truth. Many clung to one simple plea: bring them home. The search as suspension also left a moral question hanging in the air. How long should the world spend looking for the dead, and at what cost? For MH370, the price had already exceeded $150 million, the largest and most complex hunt in aviation history. Yet for some, stopping meant abandoning not just the passengers, but the very principle that no one, no matter how far they fall, should be lost forever. Then there was the psychological weight on those who had been part of the search. Naval officers who had spent months scanning empty ocean reported vivid dreams of finding the plane, only to wake with crushing disappointment. Some divers who had been on debris recovery missions described touching fragments of wing or cabin wall and feeling, as one put it, like I was holding someone's tombstone. Even for those who had no personal connection to the flight, MH370 became a symbol of how fragile our control over the world really is. It reminded us that despite satellites, flight trackers, and instant communication, there are still places beyond our reach. By 2020, 6 years after the disappearance, the Indian Ocean had returned to silence. The flagprint from Reunion sat in a climate-controlled room in France. Other pieces lay in evidence storage in Malaysia and Australia. All of it, hundreds of pounds of twisted carbon fiber, aluminum, and composite, amounted to less than 1% of the aircraft's total mass. The rest was still out there, somewhere in the black depths between Australia and Antarctica, where winter storms can generate waves the height of apartment buildings and the seafloor drops into trenches deeper than the Grand Canyon. As for the final moments of MH370, whether they were chaotic, violent, or eerily calm, we may never know. What is certain is this: at 1:19 a.m. on March 8th, a voice from the cockpit wished air traffic control good night. Within minutes, the aircraft slipped into the kind of darkness that swallows both steel and certainty. And 10 years on, the echo of that night still haunts the skies. Because in the end, flight MH370 didn't just vanish. It took 139 lives and left a hole in our understanding of the world big enough for an entire jet to disappear into.